we're at Psalm 104, which means after today, we have 46. And, we're still climbing the mountain, and having you along for this climb makes me move forward. So to each of you, much gratitude for being along for this exploration of Psalms. In the last couple months, I've learned the deep satisfaction, which is a Jewish tradition, of dedicating learning to somebody. And today, our dedication is to Howard Haas. Howard and I now go way back. It's hard to believe how years go by. But in 2002, Howard, we attended the final game of the World Series of the Angels against the San Francisco Giants. It was the first time the Angels ever made it to the World Series, and they won over the Angels in 2002, 4-3. And Howard and I were there. And maybe even more memorable for me, since I'm not an active fan these days of baseball, was that Howard took me as his guest to have lunch with the Dalai Lama at UCI, along with 50 business people. So it was a relatively small gathering to get a up-close feel for the Dalai Lama. And I hold on to the image of the Dalai Lama laughing and saying, "I know nothing about business. We Tibetans are not millionaires in our successes. But what I do know is that integrity counts for the long trajectory." So Howard Haas is a dear friend with, at this point, a nice history. And today we honor Howard. Howard, you'll have a chance to say a few words just before the Kaddish at the end. Great. A delight to have you along for what will be also, hopefully, a moment of memory making. Psalm 104, I shared with the group in my letter before, is one of the two psalms that when Robert Alter spoke on behalf of the Community Scholar Program recently, I asked him what his favorite psalms were, and he said, "My two favorite psalms," that great translator of sacred text, are Psalm 8 and Psalm 104. And I delight in having spent a good deal of time with Psalm 104, and it is a bit longer. It's 35 verses. It's a psalm I know from chanting on a new moon. It's the psalm for Rosh Hodesh. In part, as you'll see, the moon is mentioned in verse 19, but the key theme of this psalm is creation and God's ongoing active engagement and sustaining of creation. And so that is part of the image of the Hebrew calendar, where each month the moon reappears and recycles. That sense of renewal is resonant in Psalm 104. Whenever I see my dear teacher and friend, Rabbi Shalom Podwal with Dahlia, I pause to appreciate a question he asked toward the beginning of our study, and that is, what from this psalm is found in our prayers? And I will hopefully return to that. But one powerful image of what is in our prayers is that when we wrap ourselves in the tallit each morning, the first words we say is the beginning of this psalm. "Let my soul bless Adonai, Adonai my God, you are very great. With splendor and majesty you are clothed, who enwraps with light, cloak-like, who stretches out the heavens like a tent cloth." And so that is the opening in the morning. As we wrap ourselves in our prayer shawls, we quote the beginning of this psalm. But many of us, in sitting down to eat our breakfast or our lunch, if there is bread, say, "Hamotzi lecha min haaretz." That is from verse 14. So there are other parts of the psalm that are in our prayers. I'll just add one more only so I don't forget. Verse 31, Yehi chavod Adonai le'olam, yismach Adonai b'ma'asav. May the glory of Adonai be forever. May Adonai rejoice in God's works. That we say also each morning. The prayer is called Yehi chavod and has other verses after. The rabbis put these collages together to warm us up to pray to God. And so that prayer is called Yehi Chavod. It's also said in the evening as part of a prayer called Baruch Adonai Le'olam. And it's part of the first taking out the Torah on Simchat Torah. And in the chanting of Hakafot, verse 31 is also echoed. Now, this is a psalm about creation, but not about the original creation, though there's an element to inform us. This is about God who is actively involved each day on an ongoing basis with enabling the flow, the order of creation to take place. That everything that exists because of God's enduring presence. It's a psalm in which 12 times, at least in my translation, the word who with a capital W is used 12 times as the psalmist is celebrating, speaking to God, saying, God, I know who you are. You are the God who enwraps with light, who stretches, who covers, who makes clouds, who moves, who makes. And the word you appears 20 times as a pronoun. So there's a sense of the psalmist looking at the world and being wowed, and with remarkable images describes the wonder of the world of creation. That's the primary focus. Celebrating before God as the audience, the wonder of the world. I'm going now to read the psalm because I want to pace myself. But as I do, I invite you to hear this psalm differently than on other days. To hear this psalm, you might, if you have books around you or even the text, put it aside, even close your eyes, because this psalm is written like a series of images, kind of a guided imagery. And if you allow yourself to take in the psalm, and then we'll go back and I'll look to both open, I'm saying this to pace myself, there are remarkable midrashim, rabbinic commentaries on God's tallis of light. And I want to share some of those. And there's a closing story that is famous. I know the story, but this is the first time I find its embedded prompt, which is the last line, the story of Bruria guiding her husband, Rabbi Meir, not to wish for the death of sinners. And I'll show you in that last verse and tell you the story about how she parses the last verse as contained in the Talmud. But back to my preparing us to hear the psalm that I'm going to read. Here's the one thing to know in regard to the imagery. In the creation story, water will have a central part. You know, in the beginning, God is hovering over the face of the waters. Well, in the creation story, or in this image of how God created, here's what you need to know. Above the sky that we see, God has an upper chamber. If you will, it's where the water is stored. That will then be opened up from time to time to enable rain and snow. So that's up above. God has this big chamber, the storage bin of water. And under the earth, God also has deep down another large container of water out of which rivers emerge and the ocean emerges. So as you hear this psalm, that's the one piece to, if you will, clarify all the more in the imageries of water. Upper chambers, you know, where the water is stored for rain and snow and hail, and the underground waters out of which the waters that we experience emerge. So with that, this psalm opens with the same phrase we saw in Psalm 103 yesterday. And we concluded yesterday by acknowledging that 103 and 104 are partners, but distinctive. 103 had a focus on God's revelation to Moses, and in that sense, God's presence in history, with a touch of Israel by virtue of being about Moses. Here, this is universal, no mention of Israel. This is God as creator in all of God's mystery. At the same time, here you'll get the psalmist going from the universal back to more the particular, where yesterday it was the particular to the universal. All right, with that, last, Barchi nafshi et Adonai, let my soul praise Adonai. That expression occurred yesterday 3 times, twice at the very beginning and once at the end. Here you're going to get it in the opening and closing lines. It's the envelope, that phrase. But today you get for the first time a word that we identify with Psalms. Hallelujah. A Hebrew word, praise be Yah. Yah, like breath, a shortened version of Yud Hey Vav Hey. And we'll have hallelujahs continue throughout the Psalms with this first appearance today. Okay, enough introduction. I'm actually excited because in rereading this psalm with the mindset of sharing it with you, it really resonated for me how powerful this is to be heard as a guided meditation. So allow yourselves to turn off the analytic part of your brain. We'll get back to that because analysis is important. But at the same time, experience is important. Allow yourself to stand alongside the psalmist as the psalmist speaks to God about the wonders of creation. Let my soul bless Adonai. Adonai, my God, you are exceedingly great. With splendor and majesty you are clothed. Who enwraps with light, cloak-like, who stretches out the heavens like a tent cloth, who roofs with waters your upper chambers, who makes clouds God's chariot, who moves upon wings of wind, who makes messengers of winds. God's servants are the flaming fire, who established the earth upon its foundation, not to be moved forever and ever. The watery deep as with a garment, you covered it. Above the mountains, you caused water to stand. At your rebuke, they fled. At the sound of your thunder, they hurried away. They rose to the mountains. They sank down to the valleys, to the place that you founded for them. A boundary you set that they could not pass over, so that they might never return to cover the earth. Who sends forth springs into the ravines? Between the mountains they move. They give drink to every beast of the field. Wild asses quench their thirst. Above them, fowl of the sky dwell. From among the branches they are given voice. Who waters the mountains from your upper chambers? The fruit of your works sates the earth, who causes to spring up the grass for the cattle and herb for the service of the mortal, to bring forth bread from the earth and wine, which brings joy to the heart of a person, making to shine faces with oil and bread for a human heart to be sustained. Sated are the trees of Adonai, the cedars of Lebanon, which God had planted, where there are birds that nest. A stork in the cypresses are her home. High mountains are for the wild goats. Rocks are a refuge for the badgers. Who made the moon for appointed times? The sun? God knows when it sets. You place darkness, and it is night. In it are crawling about all creatures of the forest, the lions roaring for prey, requesting from ale their food. When arising is the sun, they regather, and to their dens lie down. Going out is immortal to work, to labor until evening. How many are your works, Adonai? All of them you made with wisdom. Full is the earth of your creations. This is the sea, great and many hands wide. There, crawlers without number, living creatures, small ones with big ones. There, ships move. Leviathan, this that you fashioned to play with, all of them. To you they look with hope to give their food in its season. You give to them, they gather. You open your hand, they are goodly sated. You hide your face, they panic. You end their breath, they perish, and to their dust they return. You send forth your breath, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. Utchadesh pnei ha'adamah. May the glory of Adonai be forever. May Adonai rejoice in God's works. Who looks at the earth and it trembles? God touches the mountains and they smoke. I will sing to Adonai while I live. I will hymn to my God while I still am. May my speech be pleasing to God. As for me, I will rejoice in Adonai. May sinning cease from the earth and the wicked be no more. Let my soul bless Adonai. Barchi nafshi et Adonai. Hallelujah. So a smile. I don't want to overlook smiling with you. Verse 14. Who causes to spring up the grass for the cattle, the asev, and herb for the service of the mortal. Bob Marley pointed, the great reggae singer, the Rastafarian, those who smoke marijuana as part of their religious practice, and pointed to who causes herb for the service of the mortal as the proof text that God wants us to smoke marijuana. So that's what Bob Marley said, which is just to say, when you read Psalms, there is a lot of room for interpretation. All right, with that said, let me go back through this and tell you, first I want to do the flow a little bit, and then talk about the Midrashim, the rabbinic play with this opening image of God being enwrapped with light and what that's all about. And then that closing verse where I mentioned a wise woman taught her famous rabbi husband how to better read it. So the opening, Barchi nafshi et Adonai, let my soul bless Adonai. We talked more yesterday about the concepts of origins of the word nefesh and the etymology of blessing and what Baruch means. Adonai, my God, you are Gedalta Ma'od, you are very great or exceedingly great. Hod v'hadar, there's an alliteration, that two hays. Hod v'hadar lavashta, with splendor and majesty you are clothed. And here this famous line, verse 2. O Te'or, who enwraps with light, kasalma, cloak-like. And it's not clear if it is God who is enwrapped by a cloak, and that's what the rabbis will play with in terms of God wears a tallit of light, and that light got spread out to create. Remember, day one of creation, God creates light. The sun and moon in chapter 1 of Genesis are not put in the sky until day 4. So the first thing God says is, Yehi or, let there be light. And this light here in verse 2, in which God is enwrapped, can also be understood as that is what God did to enable creation. That God stretched out the heavens and stretched out the light and that describes the beginning. And you have this image of God. Again, it's an anthropomorphism, it's a metaphor, it's a way of relating to God, to see God as, spreading the table, filled, with light, stretching out the heavens like a cloth. Here, often, because Yiri'ah is often in the context of a tent, creating, the tent of the heavens. And that image I shared, that above the sky is this upper chamber where the waters are stored. Some people, instead of who roofs with waters, who places beams for the waters, as if, again, it's an act of construction. And underneath that upper chamber are the clouds on which God rides like a chariot, moving upon wings of wind. And modern Bible scholars will say this is an echo of the Canaanite myth of Baal, who traveled on the heavens with bolts of lightning for a weapon. Again, that doesn't mean that it's taken from there. It means that that's both an archetype of celestial presence, but it's also an echo, because it is a time in which that was, if you will, part of the common folk imagery of creation, who makes messengers of the winds. Here, verse 4, that's a verse that will be quoted, by the way, in the New Testament. Let me say a word about the Christianity and this psalm. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and I don't know if you've ever been to an Orthodox service, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, what's different about those services is they use a lot of incense, a lot of pageantry, and there's rooms that people go in and out of. So the priest, has this drama of disappearing and appearing. In the Eastern Orthodox, this is part of the Vespers. It's called Adam's Song. Psalm 104 is imagined as composed by Adam after he got kicked out of the garden. So he's looking back at the garden, he's looking at the world around him, and singing God's praises as creator. And when it's enacted as part of the Vespers in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the priest will chant it from behind, outside of the royal doors, to signify being outside of the garden. So in the Catholic tradition, this is a psalm identified with Easter. And you could see that because this is a psalm about renewal. And so this is a psalm not only that has many places on a daily basis in Jewish prayer, liturgy, but it has a central place for Christians who share the Psalms as sacred texts. And one other comment in that regard, regarding verse 4, for a while when I was reading my Zohar and I would find a passage quoted of Psalms, I would write it down. And there was such a passage here. Verse 4 gets quoted in Zohar, third book, page 152, as an example that God's angels, God's messengers, verse 4, normally have no body. Angels are spirits. And so this verse is used to say they are like the wind. As you can't see the wind, you can't see the angels. But the Zohar will add, when they come to earth, they need a physical form to engage with us. So a little bit of Zohar on Psalm 4. Who established the earth upon its foundations, not to be moved forever and ever. So here with verse 5, a sense of the permanence of God's handiwork. And yet, beginning verses 6 to 13, with your permission, I'm going to go over just 5 or 10 minutes, no more today, because it's a long psalm and it's so rich in its imagery. So now feel the flow. verses 6 to 13 are the ordering of the waters. The watery deep, as with a garment, you covered it. Above the mountains, you caused water to stand. So although normally gravity pushes water down, here's the image that even on the top of mountains, there are rivers or snow, that God ultimately determines even how water will operate. And yet, at your rebuke, this is talking about the water, they fled. At the sound of your thunder, they hurried away. They rose to the mountains, they sank down to the valleys, to the place that you founded for them. Again, this could either be referring Noah's flood, or simply on an ongoing basis, God's power to direct water. A boundary you set that they could not pass over. This is in reference to the oceans. The boundary here being the sand, so that they might never return to cover the earth. And that's clearly in reference to Noah. Or in terms of there will no longer be this mass flood. And now, with verse 10, this is about the rivers. And there's a sense of order, of the interdependency of things. Who sends forth springs into ravines between mountains that they move. You can feel, and see the water flowing between the mountains in these streams, in these ravines, giving drink. And again, it's God who's enabling that every beast of the field and the wild asses, which in the book of Job, wild asses is used for an image of that which runs free in nature. All have water. And above them, in this quality of a interdependency, the fowl of the sky dwell from among the branches. And this word, afayim, appears nowhere else in Tanakh. And so some translate it as branches, others have it as foliage, only out of context. So once again, in almost every psalm, there is some poetic choice of a word that you don't find anywhere else, and that you then choose how to translate. So the fowl, in this case, the fowl, the birds of the sky, they are given voice. And now the shift to who waters the mountains from your upper chambers, the fruit of your works sates the earth. And that's the fruit of your works, meaning rain. That's the fruit of God's works here in 13. And this word sates, lahasbia, is repeated over and over in this psalm. God is sating, nourishing, replenishing the needs of creation, who causes to spring up the grass for the cattle and herb for the service of the mortal, to bring forth bread from the earth. And here's where you get the phrase, lahotzi lechem min haaretz, for the blessing. This is where the blessing of eating bread comes from, verse 14. And wine, which brings joy to the heart of a person. Here too, a biblical perspective on drinking alcohol. In context, it is a gift from God, making to shine faces with oil. That was, again, in antiquity, olive oil, how people both moisturized, but also it was seen as beautiful to have your face shining. So when you wanted to inaugurate a king or somebody in power, you poured oil on them. That's what the word Mashiach, Messiah, means, anointed with oil. And that was seen as, not unlike wine, as a enabling of joy. Bread for a human heart, enosh, to be sustained. And again, verse 16, sated are the trees of Adonai, the cedars of Lebanon, which God had planted. And in this, you'll see a back and forth between the moment and the past, and then some future. There too, time is all intermingled, just like all of creation is all interwoven. Say to the trees of Adonai, the cedars of Lebanon which God have planted, where there are birds that nest. A stork and the cypresses are at home. In Hebrew, the word stork is chasidah, that word chesed meaning kindness. And the Talmud would say, in explaining in Chulin 63a, why is the stork called a chasidah? Because it's a bird particularly kind to its young. And you can see by extension, the stork bringing the baby, as will become a more popular motif, is at least embedded in this shared image that this bird, the chasidah, is chesed, is a bird of kindness. High mountains are for the wild goats. Rocks, or some people translate it as crags, some translate it as boulders, are a refuge for the badgers. And now the order of this heavens, but an order that allows for an order of the creatures on earth, who made the moon for appointed times, the sun, God knows when it sets. You place darkness in it as night. In it are crawling about all creatures of the forest. And now we have the lions hunting at night, the lions roaring for prey, requesting from ale their food. For the psalmist, the sound of the roar of the lion is the prayer of a lion. Even the lion knows that it is God who is the source of nutrition, of the prey. But there's order. When arising is the sun, so at sunrise, they, the lions, they regather to their dens, their lairs, they lie down. And simultaneously, or almost like by rhythm, with the sun rising, people are waking up. As the lions are retreating for their rest, humans are awaking from theirs, going to work, to labor unto evening. And here's an insight of Benjamin Siegel. God is providing. But what does God provide for the humans? Oil, bread, and wine. Those are the three things we just read. Those are three things that humans have to partner with God in actualizing. You have to take, the grain and grind it to make the dough to bake the bread. You have to take the grapes and distill, and crunch and distill to make the wine. And likewise with the olives, you gotta crunch and manipulate, which is to say, in this description of creation uniquely, humans have to work. Here again, they labor unto evening. But labor here, la'avodato, is also used, as we've seen in Psalms, to serve God. Avodah, belev, the service of the heart, is prayer. So humans, distinctly in this celebration of creation, are God's partners for good. And you will see the punchline, the closing verse, we'll get to it, is although this is all beautiful and harmonious, humans have the power to muck it up with sin. That's the surprise turn in the closing line. How many are your works, Adonai? All of them you made with wisdom. Full is the earth of your creations. And here too, verse 24, one of those outbursts. You'll get another outburst in verse 31 of celebration. How many are your works, Adonai? Ma rabu ma'asecha, Adonai. All of them you made with wisdom. Full is the earth of your creation. And now he's pointing our attention to the sea. This, you can see him like we're standing next to this psalmist. He's pointing at the sea, great and many, hands wide. You can see him spreading out his hands. There, crawlers without number, living creatures, small ones with big ones, pointing to the water. And now, pointing there, ships move, Sham aniyot yahalechun, and the Leviathan. We don't know what a Leviathan is. Some say it's a whale. Some say it's a crocodile. Some say it's only a mythic animal. And there's a wonderful midrash. We get the Leviathan mentioned in Job, chapter 40 and chapter 41. Two little comments on Leviathan. The midrash is that God created a pair of everything. These are very big animals. And God said if they reproduce it's too much. They're too big. So God castrated the male and killed the female and said, the meat of the female, Leviathan, will be served to the righteous in the future time. It will be the ultimate reward, which, by the way, it's interesting because it's an animal of the sea like a whale. It's not kosher. But in the world to come, you're going to get to eat from the Leviathan. And what does God do with the Leviathan in verse 26? He fashioned to play with. And of course, you can imagine how the rabbis love this image of God is at play with the Leviathan. And it leads to the rabbis in Masechet Avodah Zarah, the tractate of idolatry 3:2, saying, God's day is divided into 4 parts, 1 for Torah study, 2 for his work of judging, 3 for feeding the world, and 4 playing with Leviathan. And the rabbis see that as the model of balance in our own lives. We must make time to play. And so this is the one place, the only place here where Leviathan is the plaything. Verse 27, all of them, to you they look with hope to give their food in its season. This is again moving toward celebration, acknowledging that it is God who gives. You give to them, they gather. You open your hand, they are goodly sated. You hide your face, they panic. You end their breath, they perish. And to their dust they return. You send forth your breath, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. And so all is dependent on God. And the world looks to God with hope. And now the outburst. May the glory of Adonai be forever. May Adonai rejoice in God's works. And now the closing of the psalm. And again, the psalmist returns to the who. The psalmist returns to addressing God and recounting God's power. Who looks at the earth and it trembles. That's earthquakes. God touches the mountains and they smoke. That's volcanoes. Such is God's power over creation. And now the close. I will sing Ashira Ladonai B'chayai. I will sing to Adonai while I live. I will hymn Lahazmir to my God while I still am. As long as I am alive, I will fulfill my purpose, which is to praise God. May my speech be pleasing to God. As for me, I will rejoice in Adonai. And now this closing line. May sinning cease from the earth and the wicked be no more. Let my soul bless Adonai. Hallelujah. Now here is, as often the case, the last verse is a bit out of the flow. It's a surprise because if you cut it off at verse 34, his hands are like this, reaching to the heavens, and you can feel him looking upward with joy. He is part and parcel of creation. The great psychologist Erich Fromm, in a book called Escape from Freedom, said that the human dilemma, he also writes this in his book called The Sabbath. Erich Fromm was a contemporary of Freud, a little bit later, important writer, humanistic writer, deeply learned Jewishly. He said the foundational human dilemma. He also wrote a book called The Art of Loving. This is there as well. And he will say that what is distinctive about being human is we see ourselves part of creation, intertwined, an integral part of all, and simultaneously a part set apart from creation. And he said the tension between being instinct-driven, being part of the flow, and simultaneously set apart with power to influence, to shape, and to be aware that I am controlling in many ways nature, he said is the foundation to human tension, and creativity at the same time. So that, again, is part of this psalm. We are part of nature to verse 34, and then verse 35. Now so 35 is our power. May sinning cease from the earth and wicked be no more. Why sinning? Sinning for the psalmist is disruptive. It's sinning that creates destruction. It's sinning that creates a disorder in a world that's otherwise ordered. Now, here's the story about this last verse as it's recorded in the Talmud, Brachot 10a. It's an unusual story in that women don't have much of a voice, usually, in what is the men's club, right? The Talmud are the men sitting around debating the Talmud. This is about a woman. She's not, if you will, part of the debate, but they said the following. There was a band of thugs living in Rabbi Meir's neighborhood. Rabbi Meir lives in Israel, 1st, 2nd century. He's a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva. And these thugs, these troublemakers, they really upset him. They don't say what they were doing, if they were taunting him, but he's told his wife that he was going to pray for these thugs to die. And elsewhere in the Talmud, they talk about the power of Rabbi's prayer. And Bruria, his wife, says to him, how can you justify such a prayer? When it says in Psalms, do you think that in verse 35, it's saying, may sinners cease from the earth? If it was to be sinners, it should have been written, Choteim will cease. But the verse says, Chataim, which can also mean sins or sinning. And she said, as soon as the sinners repent, sins and crimes will cease to be perpetrated, and therefore the wicked will be no more. And then everyone will be righteous. Rabbi Meir accepted Bruria's parsing of the verse and prayed that all people would repent, and his request was answered. Isn't that a powerful story and a beautiful? By the way, in almost all the translations, they translate this as, may sinners cease from the earth. Almost all of them. The only two places, frankly, among my 10 commentaries where I see Bruria's parsing is in a Chabad translation called Tehillim, and many of our Psalms are in our prayer book. And in our prayer book, the editor being a man named Eddie Feld, Rabbi Feld, he translates it as may sinning cease from the earth. And I liked the more active, so I chose to follow Rabbi Feld and do may sinning cease from the earth. So that's for all of us to hold on to. Last comment, because I'm not too far over time, and I know people have a lot on your plates. But this opening image is very powerful of God wrapping in light. So let me just share a couple of midrashim in that regard, in terms of God being wrapped in light. This is from a midrash on Tehillim. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzedek asked Rabbi Shmuel ben Nachmani, how did God create the radiant aura around the world? And Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani answered, God wrapped in a white tallit and illuminated the world with its light. In another collection of midrashim called Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, chapter 3, it is brought, from which place were the heavens created? From the light of the garment of the Holy Blessed One, that God was wearing. God spread out the light like a robe and made the heavens, as it said, the Lord wraps in light as with a garment, stretched out the heavens like a curtain. And last, in reference to this image, Rosh Hashanah 17 in the Talmud, God wraps in a tallit. And when did God wrap in a tallit in another time? When Moses said, Exodus 34:6, show me your glory, the Lord passed before Moses and proclaimed, Adonai, Adonai, Rachum v'chanun. That's back to yesterday. God is a merciful God. Rabbi Yochanan said, had this passage not been written, it would have been impossible to have said it. For it teaches us that the Holy One, blessed be He, wrapped Himself, as does a prayer leader, a shaliach tzibur, who recites the prayers for a congregation. And pointing out to Moses the regular order of prayers, said to him, whenever Israel sins, let him pray to me after this manner of chanting, Adonai, Adonai, al-Rachum v'chanun, God, God is a merciful God, and I will pardon them. And it will be added in a mystical commentary on this. God is wrapped in the same tallit of light that God wore in the creation of the world. And so we learn that we join the Holy One who wears the tallit of light, of mercy, and shelters us under God's tallit of light. And so the image is, as it begins, that God is enwrapped in the light of primordial creation, and that we gather who are created under God's light and find God's protective presence and illumination. Quite a remarkable psalm, a psalm of many images celebrating how the world around us is alive, dynamic, but always under God's care of kindness to sate the needs of the created. So with that, oh, Chuck, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're back. I still will write to you, and Luis. So there is, of course, much more I've gone over. So I just want to see if there's one, maybe two, because I know we're in overtime today. But this was such a rich psalm. Julia, did you unmute? Go ahead.
I was curious about the line where it says that all of this was created with wisdom. And I wonder whether there's any sense here of the wisdom from Proverbs, who is a feminine figure, because this image of creation is so complete. And I would like to see it as embodying some principle there.
So let me build on Julia's question and her awareness of the text. Verse 24 says, how many your works, ma rabu ma'asecha ya, Adonai, all of them you have made with wisdom, full is the earth of your creation. And as Julia points out, the word for wisdom here is in the feminine, chachma. So we've seen, particularly yesterday with Psalm 103, we had the word rachamim repeated. And rachamim is womb. So it's God's feminine dimension. And there is this quality that chachma has a feminine choice. And I would only be reading into why that's the case. But what is clearly true, like in Proverbs, where wisdom is presented as a woman, so that is part and parcel of the biblical use of the feminine for wisdom itself. Rabbi Podwal, and then Rabbi Podwal, and then I'll finish with Howard Haas, a couple words, and we'll do Kaddish. Go ahead, Rabbi Podwal.
Yehuda Amichai has a modern day midrash that he wrote about God enwrapped in light, which we say before putting on the tallit. And he writes, whoever wrapped in a tallit in one's youth will never forget taking it out of the soft pack, opening the folded tallit, spreading it, kissing the border along its length. Afterwards, a great sweep over the head, like the heavens, like a chuppah, like a parachute. Afterwards, folding it around one's head as if playing hide and seek, and then wrapping the body in it tight, folding it like a cocoon, and then opening it like wings for flying. And why are there stripes and not black and white squares like a chessboard? Because squares are finite, without hope, and stripes come from infinity and go on to infinity, like the runways at the airport, so that the angels may land and take off. When you wrap yourself in a tallit, you cannot forget coming out of a swimming pool over the sea and being wrapped in a great towel and casting it over one's head and wrapping it tight, and shivering a little and laughing and blessing. That the poem is put in the Mishkan Tefillah, the prayer book of the Reform movement, before putting on the tallit on Shabbat morning.
What's the title of the poem?
That's a hard question. Because it comes with a whole series of poems, and it actually may not have its own individual title.
Well,
but it's on page. It's in the Mishkan Tefillah Shabbat prayer book.
Thank you. That is a beautiful way to pull together our study. Yehuda Amichai, who passed away in recent years, was one of Israel's most engaging poets. He was a secular man, but in Israel and in his youth, the tallit were part of daily life. And I love that image of I've heard the poem before, but thank you, Rabbi Podwell, for bringing it into our gathering. I love that image of why the stripes on the tallit, because they're like runways pointing to the infinite for the angels to land. I think that is just beautiful. And so Howard Haas, my beloved friend, our educator in chief, unmute yourself for a closing couple sentences about anything that was evoked for you in our study, and then we'll conclude with the Kaddish.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. No, got to unmute again.
All righty.
Now it's unmuted. Go ahead.
Right. I want to say that it is Purim, and during Purim, we think of old friends, and the rabbi alluded to us going to the championship baseball game, but I got to let you know, the rabbi is such a man of faith. We didn't have tickets. I thought the guy had tickets, right? So the rabbi's out there scalping tickets, but he's always been a man of faith. And also, when we speak of friends, I'm going to speak a couple of friends that Rabbi and I have together, and our teachers, Reb Shlomo, we have in common Reb Zalman, Rabbi Twersky. So because it is Purim, we reach out to friends. So I'm reaching out with the rabbi to our dearest teachers and our dearest friends who are still here, but not in the physical. And all I can say is Rabbi Kol Kavod, and to everyone else, Shalom Aleichem, and may you have a joyful Purim.
Thank you, Howard. We're reminded tomorrow night to go to our website. There will be Purim services with Purim songs and spiels brought to you on Zoom. So tomorrow night and on Friday morning. With that, for those observing a Kaddish, I invite you to join together with each other. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah bi'alma divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechon v'yomechon uv'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael ba'agala uv'izman kari v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam ome'al maya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudsha berichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata, v'nechemata, damiran v'alma v'muamein.
Amen.
Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'muamein.
Amen.
Osei shalom b'romav hu ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'kol yoshvei tevel v'imru.
Amen.
Amen. I look forward to seeing all of you a week from today when we continue with Psalm 105 on Wednesday at 9:30. Again, it delights me to see each of you. I wish you all a Chag Purim Sameach, a happy Purim. Be well. Enjoy the day. May Psalm 104 continue to resonate as you look at the world's beauty around. Take care.